We start our course by talking about the Swiss linguist, the French-Swiss linguist, Ferdinand de Saussure, who was the first person to start thinking about and defining the field of linguistics. He was very interested in this process whereby the idea in the mind of speaker A gets spoken through the lips of speaker A, creating sound which goes into the ear of speaker B, into the mind of speaker B, and vice versa. Audition, hearing, leads to the mind, which then you match the concept with the sound image, the sounds and the that you heard with the concepts in your mind. Then phonation is articulation, that was his words, which that articulated phone, those phones through the air get heard by speaker B, again gets processed by that person's mind and then responds through more phones, through more sounds which get heard, and the cycle goes on and on. I'd like to dig in now that we've got a little bit more foundation in the field of linguistics, just kind of zoom out and provide some more detail about how this whole process works. This will serve us well as we move on and start preparing our way for really thinking about language instruction in second language acquisition class and in structure of English and in pedagogical grammar. So let's first start by thinking about how language production works. Language production starts with an idea in the mind. Once you have your idea, the video, the concept that you would want to share, you have to make some semantic decisions. How am I going to package that idea into words? Which information am I going to choose to include in my utterance or choose to exclude? Does the time that it happened matter? Does who did it matter? What details am I going to articulate, am I going to express, and what details am I going to erase? Once I've made all my semantic decisions and I figure out exactly what parts of the message I want to convey, then I will select morphemes from the lexicon, which will communicate that idea. From those morphemes, if those morphemes are syntactic heads, nouns, verbs, prepositions, complementizers, those heads will project a phrase. So any x being a noun or a verb or a preposition or an adjective or anything else, is going to project an intermediate level, and that phrase. That phrase, again, is like the umbrella. All of the elements which describe the head are under it. Those lexical projections, kind of like those little umbrellas, get bundled up into a syntactic tree. That now I have that whole hierarchical, that whole nested structure, which encodes the relationships between these various elements that I pulled from my lexicon. A lot of times the inflections actually come last, because inflections may have to wait until the tree is assembled and I know subject-verb agreement. Is the noun for example, grammatically feminine, so the adjective has to be grammatically feminine to match. Then I might move elements in the tree if there's any discourse forces which would want me to detach something from where it is in the tree, move it up to the top to topicalize it or to focus it. Once all of my elements are in place, all of the morphemes are in the order that I finally want to say them in, I would figure out the phonemes that each of those morphemes are. I would pronounce those phonemes by using allophonic rules to notice how is this phoneme going to be affected by its neighboring phonemes or where it appears in a syllable. And then I would eventually have articulation, which leads to phones in the air. So now I have sound waves in the air going to the other person, and they have to use those allophonic rules to decode the actual sounds they hear in the air, turn those back into phonemes, the mental sound categories that are used in this language, kind of lining up those buckets one by one as we talked about in our phoneme video. Once I have all of the phonemes in a row, I will then sort of match, does this set of phonemes match any morpheme in my lexicon? Does a p followed by an a followed by a t match any morpheme in my lexicon? Well, yeah, that could be the morpheme pat. But I might hear another t and I might hear e. Oh, maybe it's pat. Patty, so that could be a woman's name. So you're kind of constantly adjusting as more phonemes come at you. What do I think the morphemes in my lexicon are that match this string of phonemes? So once I figure that out, I divide the boundaries between those morphemes, and I have a morpheme by morpheme representation. What are the different morphemes that I have in this sound string that I'm hearing with my ear? Okay, now I have to assign each of those their syntactic category. I have to figure out which are nouns, which are verbs, which are adjectives, which are inflections, and then I will project again, like I did in the previous step. The verb would project a verb phrase, the noun would project a noun phrase, a complementizer would project a complementizer phrase, a preposition would project a prepositional phrase, and I would again have to merge those all into a tree in order to be able to get the entire syntactic map, sort of organize these are the morphemes. This is how they're all related to each other grammatically. Unmove elements. If I think something was moved, it is out of place in the tree compared to where it started from. I would sort of move it back to where it started from. Then I could interpret semantically, what does this tree mean? What do these different elements actually encode? And once I've done that semantic interpretation, I'm back to the idea in my mind. Okay, so this is the big overview. Let's apply this to a string of phonemes and see how this would work in action. Here I have a string of phones. It's in the square brackets, so it's actual sounds. A cat interested my dog. So a cat interested my dog. How do I get from this string of sounds to the picture in my mind that's sort of this sound is expressing? Well, my brain uses what it knows about those allophonic rules to turn this back into phonemes. So I know how certain phonemes are going to be pronounced in certain contexts, so I have to undo that and figure out what's the base phoneme, what's the base sound category, the bucket into which each of the actual sounds that I hear could be sorted. Then my brain takes the string of phonemes, this kind of lineup of buckets, the phoneme, the k phoneme, the a phoneme, the t phoneme, and the dots here are syllable boundaries because I would hear the boundaries between syllables. And then I have to do some matching with my lexicon. And after I've played around and figured out what are the most likely morpheme boundaries, I might get this. I've got the morpheme I've got cat, I've got interest, I've got a d, a my, and a dog. These are the morphemes which are stored in my lexicon that I think I've heard, the meaningful units of language. Now there would be lexical projection. So the noun cat would project some kind of a noun phrase. And there's different information for each given entry in my lexicon about what kinds of things can appear in grammatical relationships with it. So I know that a cat interested, the thing that a cat interests, the object of interest in this, has to be another animate object, another thing that could experience the state of being interested, which a liver can't. A cat absorbed my dog. Well, the verb absorb doesn't allow this. I cannot have an animate object as the object, an animate object as the object. Absorb is not something that could be done here. So these are impossible because of these sort of grammatical facts which are built into the lexicon. So all of these tree snippets, like the phrase and then what restrictions on what kinds of things could go into the phrase, I've got these little sort of twigs, and now I have to kind of assemble those into a tree. So basically what you'd see here, it's the same syntactic tree. This is in the S format. So a cat interested my dog. So a is telling me which cat, my is telling me which dog, interest what, interest my dog, and what is interesting my dog? A cat is interesting my dog. And here I've got all of those intermediate projections, the D bar, the N bar, the V bar, and I need that spot because I could put in more detail. I could say, many a white cat, surprisingly interested, only my dog with 3 legs, right? So I have other spots in the tree that I could put in, but here I just have this, a cat interested, my dog. But I sort of would know that there's more structure that could be added in my mind. So I've got that tree, but that's not enough. Now I have to interpret the tree. I have to figure out, based on this context, what does it mean? Interest has many different meanings. The noun interest. What does the subject do when something is interesting? Like that interested me. What's actually going on? What does the video look like? What's happening to the person who's experiencing interest versus inducing the interest? My dog. What does that mean about the relationship between me and my dog? That I bought it, that it's a part of my body. My can actually encode many different types of relationships. Dog and cat. What does something have to be to count as a dog? What does something have to be to count as a cat? What's the prototypical dog? What's the prototypical cat? ED in the past tense. what does that past tense information actually mean? So I'm taking all these morphemes that were present, and now I'm trying to work backwards from that to figure out the video. What has to be true if I heard those morphemes? How would those things sort of all come together? And now I end up at a picture like this, where my dog is being very interested in a cat, and I could say the cat interested my dog. A cat interested my dog. And this also works in reverse. Let me say that I wanted to start with a picture and then turn it into sound. So we just did language processing, where I started with a sound and turned it into an image. Now I'm going to do language production, where I start with an image, turn it into sounds. So here's the image, and maybe I'm calling you on the cell phone from the Serengeti, and I want to describe to you what I saw here as I'm standing here. So I have to pick out different information. What details am I going to include in my language? What details am I going to exclude? What's important? What's the foreground? What's less important? I'm going to make it the background. So let's say that I picked out that sun and there's some sheep, and the fact there's sheep grazing. I'm going to ignore the tree for now. I'm going to ignore the clouds. There's other things that I'm just sort of not going to focus on. I'm not going to tell you about. These are called semantic decisions. And now I have to say, well, there's only one sun. So if I'm talking about the sun, I probably want to use the. Do I want to include any adjectives? Do I want to say the red sun, the glowing sun, the hot sun? Is set a process or an event? Should I say the sun was setting, or should I say at the sunset? How do I want to conceive of this thing that I'm seeing? As could mean for that reason. It could mean at the same time as. What's the difference? I could use as. Maybe I want to choose while. Are these animals sheep? Are they ewes? Are they lambs? Are they livestock? Are they animals? These could all be true, but I have to figure out how specific or how generic I want to be. Sheep, is it plural or is it singular? I can't really tell from here. What do I mean? What verb conjugation do I have to use as I use the word sheep? Do I use the sheep, maybe some sheep, maybe 2 sheep, 3 sheep? How do I want to determine the set of sheep that I'm talking about with the determiner? What's the verb here? They ate, they munched, they stood, they grazed. I have to choose what I want to call this action that I'm observing. And so let's say that I've figured out this is the idea I want to convey. As the sun set, sheep grazed. So I've made all my semantic decisions, and this is the important thing that I want to communicate out of that picture that we just saw. Well, now I've got all of these lexical heads. Sheep is a noun, it projects a noun phrase. Graze is a verb, projects a verb phrase. As is a complementizer, and so on. So these heads project their phrases. This is called lexical projection. Then I want to tie these together. So sheep graze, that's like sort of the basic version of the sentence. The sun set. These are 2 clauses on their own, but I'm going to link these clauses using the complementizer as. That's what clauses can do. So I might say sheep graze as the sun set. And this would be sort of packaging all of these things together, tying up those little bundles of sticks and making a whole tree out of it. But maybe I think that as the sunset is the most important thing. It's what I really want to focus on, make the foreground. So sheep graze as the sunset, I'm actually going to move that element to the top. As the sunset, sheep graze. And then I've got my syntactic tree the way that I want it. Now I have to line up my morphemes and try to pronounce it. So I've got those morphemes lined up. As the sunset, sheep graze. I have to figure out what are the phonemic categories, the sound categories, the phonemes that I need to pronounce in order to create those morphemes. Allophonic rules will tell me exactly how I would want to pronounce each of these, and allophonic rules are going to be different for each individual. They're our own accent. So if I was an American, I might pronounce that set of phonemes as the sun set, sheep grazed. If I was South African, I might say is the sun set, sheep grazed. Is the sun set, sheep grazed. So it'd be an Afrikaans accent. I'm not that great at it, but you get the idea that I could turn the same phonemes into allophonic rules differently depending on my accent, and then the final thing in those square brackets would be the actual sounds. The actual sounds which come out of my mouth, my body would pronounce it, my tongue would move, my lips, my lungs, my vocal cords, and the sound waves would leave my mouth, which would go to my listener. So, this is bottom-up language processing and language production. It's based on this idea that language is built from morphemes and assembled into words. Those words get assembled into phrases, which get assembled into clauses. At the same time, there's a totally different system called top-down processing, in which language is built from statistically frequent combinations and chunks. Something like under the weather isn't actually made of under plus the plus weather. It's its own lexical entry. We kind of have to process that top down. And it turns out one of the things we'll see in second language acquisition is language works partly because we're doing sort of bottom-up language processing and top-down at the same time. Bottom-up processes of language production and top-down processes of language production at the same time. That's what helps it be more efficient. I hope in this video you were able to kind of get a picture of how all of these things connect, pronunciation, lexicon, and grammar, especially in this circle of conversation that keeps going back and forth. And then that circle of conversation is what we would be studying in conversation analysis, which is a kind of discourse analysis. Or if it was just one person's utterance, we could be studying them as a narrative or a text analysis, some other aspect of discourse analysis.